So a few weeks ago, I was looking at someone sort of review or talk about this show I was watching, and in this show, there was a very broken family, and so people were not treating each other the best, and it kind of hurts a little bit to see like, oh, I wish things were better. And this person that was reviewing this was saying how it was so unfair that one of these people in this relationship were being so unfair, so uncaring about this other person, that they should be removed from this family entirely, that they should go to jail, that they should be kept away from this person because clearly this person was harmful, actively harmful to this family member. And I was thinking about that, and surely when we look at this passage today, we'll see that there are people that are oppressed, there are people that are deeply hurt, that they are people that we want to protect and that we're called to also look after. But I just wonder, it is something to not sit well with me with that. The language that they were using, it's almost like that we wanted to divide people into categories of either oppressed or oppressors. And it seemed to not really see people all as people. In any case, I think we'll look deeper into my thoughts as we go through this passage today. And so let's show it on the slide again. Just be the next slide. So it says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So we're just going to break down this verse. It's the only verse that we're looking at today, but I promise you it'll be quite interesting. So the first word that we're going to be looking at is the word religion. My slides are a little bit out of order there. But yes, we're going to be looking at this first chunk. We're going to be looking at this verse in 3 smaller chunks. And so the first word that we see there, religion, is, I'll try to pronounce it, but I might butcher the pronunciation, but thrieskia. And this is a pretty interesting word. Oh, it's very small. But it's an interesting word because it only shows up 4 times in the New Testament, and 2 of which only shows up here in James. And what this means is that it's a religion that is an outward expression. But James here is talking about an outward expression of this religion that is pure and undefiled, or another word in another translation is faultless. So in ancient Israel, we know that there are some sacrifices that are a means of honoring God. And yet, there are times when prophets attacked these practices because they were unable to shape the character of the people that were participating in these ritual sacrifices. For example, in 1 Samuel 15:22, it says, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offering and sacrifices as much as obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than to sacrifice." So the problem with some of these external religious observances and practices that the Israelite people were doing is that they were only following the law as a means to an end, but not really understanding the spirit or what it means beyond just that practice. And the language that we also see here in this first part about pure and undefiled, when we hear this kind of language, it seems that we are drawing some sort of separation, some sort of way of not mixing things together. But James is insisting here somehow that this genuine religion This pure and undefiled religion is supposed to be a life-changing force that's more than just an external, but it springs from an inner spiritual reality that expresses itself in love and holiness. Verse 26 and 27 is the closing verses of this first chapter. And where verse 26 deals with verse 19 to 21, talking about the tongue, verse 27 talks about, it recaps 22 to 25, which is all about the doing, the being a doer of the word. Not just being a mere worshiper on Sundays or on a religious celebration, ritual, or party, but to do more than that. In John 4:22, Jesus says to the woman at the well, "You Samaritans worship without knowing what you worship, while we worship what we know." And this word worship is pretty closely linked to this word religion, but this worship, used in this sense, Jesus is saying that this worship is defective compared to worship that is in spirit and in truth. And so another way that James describes this pure and undefiled religion, also pointing to other places where he talks about this, is nothing special about that particular word usage there, but is really just trying to bring us back to the same point. That in verse 21, talking about setting aside filthiness, or in verse 4, where it talks about spiritual maturity, or in verse 6 to 8, where it talks about people that are doubting, or being unstable, or being double-minded. That is the type of thing that James is talking about. And so, luckily for us, when we talk about this pure and undefiled nature of religion, it's really about God's character. And for Jesus, the center of God's character is his compassion and mercy expressed in the golden rule, and also when we say, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, to love your neighbor as yourself. But for some Jews, this holiness had to do with ritual purity, and they were separating themselves from the world. But we also know from verse 26 that any religious practice that isn't influencing the heart, isn't taming the tongue, this is worthless. Such a religion has no power over human hearts. It doesn't allow God to be at work in us. So let's take a look at the second part, to visit the orphans and widows in their affliction. So James is describing a very specific type of caring here. In some versions of Scripture, we see the word caring. Here, in ESV, we see the word visit. But this verb in the Greek, which we'll see on the next slide, is a type of caring that only appears in one other place, in Matthew 25:36, where Jesus says, "I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me." This is the kind of faith expressing itself through love that we hear about in Galatians. Now, this is interesting because we can kind of answer my initial question with this analysis of this verse. Because my initial thought was, is there some sort of guideline that we can look at the Scripture where we can define where someone is the orphan or the widow? But here, it's not really about trying to define some very strict theology, but it's describing a type of behavior that James thinks that a Christian should be displaying. That if you have a religion that is pure and undefiled, then you'll see behavior like this. Why do you care about these people? Because it comes from inside. Because you have this changed spiritual inner reality that can express itself in this way that that Jesus also displayed to others. Now, in this verse, if we go back to our verse 27, we can also divide this passage into two other parts. Is that if we want to see a religion that is pure and undefiled before God, then there's two conditions. That first one, yes, we must always have a practical, there must always be action with our religion. That is not only something that is in our head where it never expresses itself. It's not just some intellectual assent where we agree and says, yes, that's good, but we never care. And second of all, it's to keep oneself unstained from the world. What that means is that genuine religion must always be pure and unspotted. There's an encouragement that I would like to share. I've been really getting into stories recently, and this kind of helped me because actually before we get into this last part of the verse, I want to just stop and talk about the widows and orphans for quite a bit. There's a few things that I want to talk about. First is that, who are these widows and orphans? Could it be us? In the old Roman days, there's maybe not really a lot of social services to care for people that are widows, that are orphans, that are unfortunate. Maybe the best that they have is some bread that is handed out, but really not anyone to care for them. But these days, we have a lot more government services that care for people, and perhaps one day when we read this passage, there might be someone that lives in a society where all widows and orphans are taken care of, and so do they think to themselves, oh, my job is done. There's nothing else to do now. Or could it be that it's not really talking about specifics, but about the attitude of looking out for people, that are less fortunate than us, even people that are outside of the Christian community. This is not something new. This is something that James is bringing up word for word from many places in the Old Testament, in Isaiah, in Deuteronomy, in Leviticus, in Proverbs. There are so many places where God's character is always about having this special concern for people that are open to exploitation. And so, yes, there was the story that I was reading, and there was this thought about what if you spent a whole lifetime with somebody and you establish this relationship and you know this person very well and you're good friends with them, but then what if at the end of your life you go back in time and then you see this person again? What would happen to you and all those feelings that you have for this person? They don't know you, but you know everything about them, and there's so many movies of this kind of thing, right? And we just want to, tell them, be like, oh, I know what kind of person you are. You're so great. And, we spent all this time together. And when I was thinking about that, I was also encouraged because I think in some ways this is actually how God also sees us. That we don't yet know fully all the things that God will do for us. Of all the times when we want to cry, or when all the times when we don't know how to get through something, and it seems like only one or two people in the whole world would understand that very special moment. How would we see ourselves when we see that God sees all these things, knows all these things, knows that He will be there for you, but you just maybe can't see it yet? That longing, that extreme longing for you to just be able to grasp that kind of care and love and understanding. And I feel that sometimes maybe we don't see that we think that we are alone, that we are uncared for, or somehow we messed up super bad in some way, and we just don't understand how can anyone, if they found out, how could they forgive me, or how could they understand this is something that only I have to carry alone? So recently I was hanging out with two other people and we were having a chat about whether we really know each other. And I had a thought after I had this conversation, is that maybe, in some way, this, I guess, something to learn about me, but I have a bit of avoidance anxiety. When I'm really worried about something, then I will not touch that thing until I somehow can think of a solution for it. And sometimes it might come off as ghosting people. I'm sorry if that was you. I don't think I did that to anyone, but if I did, I'm sorry. And so when I was having this conversation with my these friends, I was thinking to myself, actually, I think I know myself very well, but maybe because when I have this kind of anxiety, what I'm actually doing is that I'm projecting a type of person that I am that I'm really not. And when I don't really live up to my thought of myself or my image of myself, then there's some clash and there's some tension. And when we start thinking of all these mechanisms to kind of deal with it. So I think that was a bit of a revelation for me to really think about. Maybe sometimes we aren't all alone in our head. There are people, our friends, that maybe do understand us, but most of all, God understands. And that when we see widows and orphans, we might think of a very literal sense, and we think, oh, it has to be literal orphans and widows. So I'm not, maybe I think to myself, maybe I'm not. So that means I have the responsibility to find widows and orphans and care for them. But I think it's not about drawing that line about where the oppressed and the unfortunate begins and where everyone is the haves instead of the have-nots, but really just a call for a reminder for Christians to care for one another. How often have we, when was the last time we specifically found someone that maybe we had some concern for, or maybe something that we're so concerned that maybe we talk about them in a friendly, not harmful, gossipy way, perhaps. But in that way that we're thinking about this person, have we reached out to them? Have we thought about them? Have we cared about them? So this is the type of thing that James is talking about. Are we actively trying to, what kind of community are we actively forming? And so in this way, sometimes, yes, we should care for other people if we have not really been thinking about it. But also, I guess the encouragement is to let other people encourage you as well. Sometimes we want to be strong. I guess something else to learn about me is I have a bit of I'm not sure what to call it. I have a bit of a complex where I want to be a hero. And so I would always want to do everything myself. It's difficult for me to ask for help, and I think I almost feel good from suffering alone. But that's something that I have to fight, that I have to struggle with. That is not the Christian calling. It's not the calling for a Christian to suffer alone and be alone, but really to lean on each other and to care for each other as a community. And as I get into this third part here, it will come clear why it's so important. Okay. And so, again, let's look at this third part here, that we have to keep oneself unstained from the world. What does it mean to keep oneself unstained? I think it's unfortunate when some people perhaps see that this world is overly hostile, that that we have to remain unstained, we have to keep ourselves as far away from it as possible. And so let's dig into this word, world, and the word for it is cosmos. In other places where this word is used, it's to describe a system, sometimes to describe a system of evil that pervades every sphere of human existence. Sometimes it's just talking about the world or the universe, or just about how it's our current situation in contrast with this eternal future life that we'll have. But here, James is using it in the first sense, that this world is rooted in a lot of evil, and it pervades every part of our lives. And yet, there's this tension here where James isn't saying because there's so much evil in the world that you must stay away from it or else it'll pollute you. The background for this PowerPoint is this water that is, and this oil that is sort of trying to mix together. And this other side of this tension is that when Jesus came to earth, he walked among us, and he was in this world. And yet he was not corrupted by the world. He was not polluted from the world. And in fact, he was purifying the world. He was there that this the holiness of God was guarded from this pollution. And that there is actually no sense to be in, absolute fear of being a part of the world, from fear that it will somehow influence us from the inside, and then we'll somehow be slowly brainwashed into normalizing sin. But we should exist in this tension where we recognize that we should be mindful to prevent ourselves from being polluted by the world, but also that we are also called to be part of this world and to share the gospel of this world, to be the light of the world. So one of the dangers, however, that what would happen if we are not careful is that we fail to recognize sin and redefine it to make it more savory. We'd say things like, "Oh, this is just how I am," or "This is how the world works. There's nothing I can do to make it better." And what's so dangerous about this is that we have a very good ability to become numb to evil, both as individuals and as organizations. So a thought that we might have is, let's say there was some civil war that broke out in a third world country, or a war that breaks out in general. We might spend a month or two and we'll be so outraged, or there's some political scandal, or some thing that we can all mostly agree that it's evil. But for the longer and longer these things go on, and we can see it over and over again in the news, then we sort of become numb to it, right? That we want to say, let's say we have a friend that learns about it for the first time, we want to say, "Oh, no, that's just how the world is. Sorry." And why I bring this up is because to stress more about this concept of community, we are not only talking about at the individual level about sin, about being unstained from the world, but it's that there's a communal aspect to how sin operates. But we think for a moment that, let's say there is people that are really concerned with social justice would say that there are a lot of things in our culture that lead people to believe or practice certain things that we would consider to be evil, let's say. But it's not, and maybe these things completely fly under our radar and need to be brought awareness to because there are things that have just been normalized over time. And so would we blame that certain individual, or would we say that because there was some sin in the past, it gives rise to sin in another place or for another person that they were not aware. Or let's say there was a broken family, and some of the things that were imparted on the children maybe were a result of some sin that was in the previous generation or even further beyond. And so we should also be aware that sin is not only just personal. And what this means is that this is a more reason, actually, for us to care for one another. That caring for one another, we are simultaneously caring for other people. We are also tackling maybe some evil, some filthiness, as James puts it in verse 21. That to put this aside, it's something that we have to fight together, not just only on an individual level, that we sit down at home and we sort out all our thoughts and we say, these are the right things to believe and do, and other people that do these things, I don't care. And so again, that means we also live in this tension where we're not responsible for other people's sin, but at the same time, we also need to care for them. And they also are, so we're just all accountable for each other. And one more thing that we need to talk about is when we talk about orphans and widows and being unstained, some people would see this as saying that poor people are the people, the demographic that is pious. And for us to to show this kind of piety is that we also should try to be as close as being poor and things that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount as possible. And in the earlier part of James 1, around verse 10, around 8 to 10 or so, it talks about what it's like to be rich and how it can be difficult sometimes. But here, it never says anywhere that being rich is inherently sinful. But what James is warning here is that wealth can be something that would very easily corrode our sense of caring for other people. Can you imagine that someone that is very wealthy might be constantly very invested in the things happening in this world? They might look down on other people that just, not because they hate them or anything, but just because they become either a threat or they can see them as maybe there's some opportunity maybe to take advantage of them or something, but there's a lot of things that could happen. And James warns about this, but there's nothing that he really talks about as saying that, we have to get rid of all our riches. There's a conversation that I had once that I also talked, I think, a little bit about long ago, is that a lot of people on very, very into this concept of equality in wealth, perhaps, would argue that, they point at verses like this, and they would say, look, if you are tolerating this kind of thing, that you are not, that how could you still be here, and how can you let widows and orphans and these people that are continuously disadvantaged exist? If you truly want to live out the gospel, then you have to take radical action. But again, I don't think James is talking about that kind of large, sweeping theological statement, but he's simply talking about Christian conduct. That have you really cared about other people? Have you cared about the community? A question that I have had once is, in a conversation with someone, is doing good always a conscious effort? No matter how spiritual and mature we come, is it always a requirement that we have to put in conscious effort to be good? Is it that we can train good habits and become more in tune with God's will, for example? I think this is something that we can think about as we go further into James. I seem to have a page missing. That's okay. I'll make a conclusion that. So I think there are two things that we need to pay attention to when we are looking at this particular verse, is that genuine religion in God's eyes must always be practical. There's a practical side, but there's also this side where we must be also aware that we should be unspotted from the world. Excuse me. But yes, so these are something to keep in mind. My final thought is just again the Matthew 25. Oh, sorry. One last thing. Okay, I have in my slideshow the very, very last slide. Okay, so this is something, just something for us to think about as we go forward with this chapter. So this is you've probably seen this before. It's the trolley problem. And this particular website that I found, it's not only talking about the trolley problem, but it's talking about very absurd scenarios that you would find. And so sometimes we might think of ourselves as really understanding who it is we have to care for, who it is we have to love. And so this really challenged me when I looked at it, because it asks, initially it was some very basic questions that we've all seen before. Like, oh, there's one track with 5 individuals, there's one with just one. But then there was some very other interesting scenarios where what if one track had your best friend? And what if one track had, let's say, some of your relatives? Or what about it was someone that you really hated? Or what if it was simply just your next Amazon package will be very late? And when I looked at these things, it was very telling that I actually was not very good at agreeing, even with other people, what are the priorities that we should have when we come to valuing certain people over others. And this could be problematic if we just kind of all decided what was right and wrong, because there was a lot of people that would be left behind. But thinking again that God cares for us and doesn't see us in this way, but he sees us all as, yes, we are broken people, but also someone that has has, before we were born, seen our whole lives and still loves us. And by proving that with the cross, I think it's something that we can learn to open up to God. And by experiencing that, I pray that will be something that we can also share that kind of care and love for other people. Let's pray. Father God, there are times when we want to see ourselves a certain way, that we don't understand ourselves, or when we can't see other people the way that you do, Lord. And maybe because of something cultural, or it could be some hurt, or it just could be This could be something that is unresolved, some unresolved pain. Lord, I pray that we'll look to you. We'll look to you, and that if we have something that we fear that we don't want to bring to you because we could be rejected, that, Lord, I pray that we'll be able to look to the cross, that we'll look to all the times in Scripture when you've promised that you do care about those that are unseen in this world, that are uncared for, that people look down upon, Lord. And you command us to care for these people, Lord. That you really, really care about them. Lord, I just pray that if this is something that we are feeling, that we will come to you and be healed. That we can be healed together as a community. Thank you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.